righty, we are back, my friends. All prophecy fulfilled. We are on lesson number 16 of the Gentiles, Christianity's best kept secret. Last lesson, I got into Romans chapter 9. I got a little bit distracted because as I veered down that path of Abraham's seed, but I took care of that. And we're still in Romans 9. I'm going to get to the point that I wanted to make today. It's a powerful lesson that really just adds more evidence to the point that I've been making all along. This is really good stuff. So last lesson, you remember we got into Romans 9, the early part of Romans 9, and Paul is he's obviously focused on Israelites, right? Verses 3 through 5, his countrymen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, and he mentions their fathers, right? So he's talking about that circle. Remember that circle that I talked about? The circle of Israel that is Israel, that was Israel. It was all Israel, both houses. That was Abraham's seed. Now, he goes on to talk about Jacob and Esau, and that's where you get into, he starts talking about, well, predestination, not in the sense that most Christians seem to think he's talking about. They actually think Paul's talking about them and how God predestined them, the Christians, for everlasting glory. Hallelujah. No, he's not really talking about that. Really what Paul is talking about, he's talking about how Yahweh chose one nation really over another, how God chose Jacob over Esau. He chose Jacob, which means he chose Israel for his purpose. You might say he predestined Israel for his purposes, and maybe he predestined the elect of Israel for his purposes. We'll look at that. But that is consistent with the story. They were chosen. Jacob was chosen, his elect, the seed of Abraham. So let's pick this up in verse 20. Romans 20, let's go 20 through 23. But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? Does not the potter have power over the clay, from the same lump make one vessel for honor and another for dishonor? What if God, wanting to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory? I am so glad I am a vessel of mercy. No, that's not what he's talking about. Now, remember a couple lessons ago, please say you do, with the Cornelius lesson, we looked at those 4 contextual clues in Acts chapter 10. Well, truth is, there's contextual clues in every stinking verse, but and I referenced Acts chapter 10, verse 11. And behold, heaven opening, and a certain vessel as a great sheet descending, being let down by the earth by 4 corners. Okay, now that particular word, vessel, skaios, it means an implement, it's an instrument, it's something to be used. And I talked about that. We see that elsewhere, like in Acts 9, where Paul is referenced as a chosen vessel of God. But it was particularly pertinent to Cornelius' story because he was a lost, scattered Israelite of the nations coming into Yahweh, into the new covenant. But we saw that, why was that important? Well, it was like a sign pointing back to Israel's story. It was a contextual clue, like Hosea 8:8, where Israel is swallowed up. Now they are among the Gentiles, the nations, like a vessel, kali, in which is no pleasure, and that's the Hebrew equivalent. So, vessel. Now, we're not going to put all the weight, all the cards on this particular word, but it's a clue, and it's significant, because here Paul is referencing these vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy. Israel was swallowed up. They were scattered to the 4 corners, and then here in the last days, he got Peter. What does he see? Well, he sees a vessel coming in from the 4 corners, carrying all sorts of unclean animals. Kind of sounds like a gathering, doesn't it? Well, it was. Here we are in Romans 9, and we see vessels of mercy, and we see vessels of wrath who have been prepared. And this isn't an accident. This isn't a coincidence here. The vessels fit perfectly in Israel's story, in my humble opinion. And it's simple, really. Wrath was, why is Paul talking about wrath here in Romans 9, right? Wrath on these vessels, or mercy to these vessels. Well, wrath was coming to Israel. Judgment. According to Paul, the law didn't only bring death. What did it bring? The law brings wrath. Wrath is specific to Israel, is pertinent to Israel's story. Israel's final judgment was impending. All Israel would be judged, both Jews and Gentiles within Israel. All would be judged. And I'm going to say it again for the 100th time. When it comes to salvation, when it comes to redemption, when it comes to, yes, wrath and judgment, the dichotomy, the distinction is always within the circle of Israel. It's all tied to Israel because it's all tied to law, wrath and law. The vessels, whether vessels of wrath or vessels of mercy, right? It's all within Israel. That's what the judgment is about. And I mentioned Romans chapter 2 last lesson, 2:12. For as many as have sinned without the law will also perish without the law. But as many as have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. And so we talked about that, and we connected that to Galatians chapter 3. Israel's scripture confined all under sin. Well, it confined all Israel under sin because the sin was confined via the law, right? In other words, all Israel was connected to law that had imputed their sin. That's why they were confined to sin. So by the time the New Testament rolls around here, right, those who sinned without the law were descendants of Israel scattered in the nations, scattered among the Gentiles, right, and who were not practicing or law practicing participants of Israel. That's why they were without the law. And so some of those would hear the gospel, they would reject it, and they would perish without the law, according to Paul. But on the other hand, you got the law-practicing Jews who sinned in the law. They would hear the gospel, they rejected it, and likewise they would perish. But Paul seems to say here that they would be judged by the law, the very law that they practice. So how does this relate to anything? Okay. What Paul is talking about here, it all points back to Israel and their prophets, their story, their trajectory, as I like to say, that would eventually bring them to their promised redemption. Remember Hosea? Of course you do, because that's all I ever talk about. What would happen to Israel? Well, Romans 9:23, that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory. Trajectory. Israel's story, the elect, the entire thing's a setup. That's what it is. It was prepared beforehand for glory. There was a beginning, but there was an end that was prepared beforehand for glory. Now, I know a lot of Calvinist Christians like to say that, God has prepared them for, for glory, but I just don't see them in the prophets. I see Israel. I see the prophets speaking of other vessels, and that makes sense. Israel being tossed out in the nations like a worthless vessel. So could that be the preparation for their later glory, like in the last days? Could that have been the plan? To eventually, bring them in like wild, clean animals riding a vessel, right, from the four corners of the land per Peter's vision, right? Could that be it? Well, you know what? I think the next 3 verses clear this up. Here we go. Romans 9:24 through 26. Even us, whom he called. Remember, this is coming just right off the tail end of what I just read there, okay? The vessels of mercy prepared, beforehand for glory. Even us, whom he called, not only of the Jews, but also of the Gentiles. Jews, Gentiles. Now listen to this. As he says in Hosea. I think we've talked about that. I will call them my people who are not my people, and her beloved who was not my beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said of them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. Bam! I hope you know what's on your screen there. Are you? This is inescapable. I don't want to escape it. It's undeniable, and I don't want to deny it. The Gentiles here, being prepared for glory, are the very ones spoken of by Hosea. Hosea, as you know, we've talked about it, Hosea was dead center and specifically focused on Israel, Ephraim, house of Israel. Paul here is literally, unequivocally, positively identifying these Gentiles right here as Hosea's Israelites. Gentiles, Israelites. Boom, right there. In fact, if I could just bring my excitement down a little bit, in the very next sentence, Paul literally identifies these Gentiles as Israelites again. It's like a stake right here. Ready? Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. Now, actually, I think Paul here, he's drawing from Hosea and Isaiah, or maybe he's kind of blending them, I don't know. But sand of the sea. Remember that? Sand of the sea. What did Hosea say about sand of the sea? Even though Ephraim would be not his people, yet the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea. And Paul here is applying this directly to the Gentiles that he identified as Hosea's Israelites. Oh, and this is like I was saying here. I don't want you to miss this. And a lot of people switch this around. They think there's something a disconnect between 26 and 27, and there's not. It's the same thing. When he says, Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. Okay, again, he's not suggesting that the previous three verses, 24 through 26, were concerning Gentiles, and then 27 and 8 are about Israel. No. As in, the prophets had two different groups. One was all Israel, both houses, and the others were Joe Blow pagans out there. No, that's not what he's saying here. He's saying Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel, just like Hosea cries out concerning Israel. The only difference is Paul uses ethnos. He uses Gentiles for Hosea's reference. So he's just keeping in context with Hosea's story. Israel in the nations, ethnos, goyim. Okay, now let's get to what Isaiah said here. Virtually the same thing. So if he's citing from Isaiah, he's citing from Isaiah chapter 10, 20 through 22. On that day, the remnant of Israel and the survivors of the house of Jacob will no longer depend on him who struck them, but they will be truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, a remnant of Jacob to the mighty God. Though your people, O Israel, be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant will return. And I know this kind of seems like overkill. I do this a lot. But we have to see that Paul is applying these Israel-centric promises and their fulfillment to these Gentiles, these ethnos. But at the same time, he's identifying these Gentiles as descendants of Israel. That's why he's hearkening back to the prophets. So the Gentiles and Israel, in this context, it's two sides of the same coin. He's taken that circle that's been divided. He's saying, here, they're coming back together, right? And, you know, by the way, these passages, what Paul's saying here, you know, again, this wouldn't have really made a lick of sense to the average Joe Blow pagan there in Rome who knew absolutely nothing of Israel's story, right, of their history. So like I've been saying from the beginning, the distinction between Jew and Gentile, it's always within that first covenant body, Israel. And this is the lens that I think we have to look through. And when we do, things just make sense. It comes together. Point in case. Finishing up here as we continue. Paul confirms that his mission was to Jew and Gentiles. And again, it's very clear who he's talking about when we have this lens on. In verse 30 through 32. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness. Why? Because they didn't seek it by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. And again, the overwhelming presumption is that, Jew, and you got Gentiles and you got Israel. So, people just don't want to accept the fact that within Paul's lens, these Gentiles and these Israelites, they're all within that Israel circle. Okay, that it's all Israel. And it's not that difficult to see. This is reminiscent of Romans chapter 2, 12 through 14, where you got two groups in view. You got the Jews and you got the Greeks. So you got those with the law. This is Romans chapter 2, which is really saying the same thing as Romans chapter 9 here. You got those with the law. You got practicing Jews, right? And then you got those without the law. You got Greeks, Hellenized Israelites, if you will. You got those practicing the law. Those are Jews. You got those who don't. Those are Israelites. Those who had forsaken it. Those are descendants of Israel. You got those sinning with or in the law. Those are Jews. You got those sinning without the law. Again, Israelites, alienated from the covenant community, non-practicing. That's why they're apart from the law. That's why they're without law. Either way you slice it, the majority of all Israel, of either the house of Israel or house of Judah, the majority were not seeking Yahweh through faith. That's why only a remnant would return. A remnant. Only the elect were. Now, those were the remnant of faith, and we know that. That's the faith factor. Those of faith were being fished out of the nations, and that's what Paul's doing here, right? The sheep were coming home through a new covenant to the shepherd. Okay, same thing here. This is what he's saying here in Romans 9, 30 through 32. That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. That is the elect. They are the elect in the nations, the Israelite-gentiles who did not have law, but in the last day. Remember, if you will turn, said Yahweh back in Deuteronomy, if they will turn, well, they're going to find him. Well, they were finding him in the last days. They were paganized, scattered Israelites who did not follow law, circumcision. They did not pursue righteousness in the nations. But they were turning. It's all coming full circle. Romans 9, 31 through 32, but Israel, pursuing the law, has not attained to the law of righteousness. Why? Because they didn't seek it by faith. So I guess what I'm saying here, or what I'm getting at, is that really the two distinguishing requisites, I guess, of new covenant entrance. It was basically two things. Number one, you had to be Abraham's seed. You had to belong. You had to be a descendant of either the house of Israel or the house of Judah. You had to be a part of all Israel, the circle, because it was to Israel, to Abraham's seed, to whom the promises pertain to. And we looked at that last lesson. Okay? Because only those within that circle would have been rendered dead in their sins and trespass against the original first covenant. Only those within that circle needed new covenant life, which only that new covenant could bring to those who'd been made dead by the first one. That's pretty simple. I've been saying that a lot. So number one, you had to be Abraham's seed. Number two, in the words of the great theologian George Michael, you had to have faith. Faith, 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 faith. So that's about it, I guess. And I hope you're not missing the big takeaway. What I really want you to see here, and if you're missing it, it's probably because I didn't do my job, that the Gentiles here being prepared for glory are the very ones spoken of by Hosea. They are Israelites. That's the point. Paul identifies Gentiles, those of the ethnos, the goyim. He identifies Gentiles as Israelites. Gentiles, Israelites. And the truth is, the only Gentiles targeted by Paul, by Peter, by the apostles, by Jesus himself, the only Gentiles in the New Testament being drawn in through the gospel were Israelites. They were Israelites made Gentile, or as Gentile, or among the Gentiles, or considered Gentile. However you want to put it, it doesn't really matter. Either way you slice it, the only Gentiles that are germane and pertinent to Israel's story were Israelites themselves. That's about it. And that's the truth, Ruth. See you next lesson. Thanks for joining me, and take care, y'all. Adios.